Okay, welcome back to day 79. So we're going to continue on with the urinary system. So just kind of quick heads up, the things that I want you to know. So we're going to get into some pretty good detail here, but the major things I want you to walk out knowing is that blood enters the kidneys, where it's then filtered. This filtering happens in units called nephrons in the kidneys. And basically, red blood cells and large proteins remain inside the capillary, so they never leave the blood vessels. Whereas other things like water, salts, and waste are partially removed from the blood, and then whatever is needed, like water or whatever it is, can be reabsorbed. So we kind of get rid of everything except the stuff that's too big, and then we put back the important stuff, right? So what isn't needed is then sent on to the bladder as urine. But the stuff that's needed comes back and becomes part of the blood that continues to cycle through the body here. Okay, so blood supply. So the blood going through the kidney is a big thing. So about 1/4 of all the total blood in your body passes through the kidneys each minute. So in every 4 minutes, you've completely cycled all the blood in your body there. So the renal artery provides each kidney with arterial blood supply. And then from there, so here's our aorta going to our renal artery. So then blood flows through a whole series of arteries, capillary beds, and ultimately veins before returning to the inferior vena cava. So we've got our renal artery, and then it's going to go through this whole series. Segmental artery, interlobar artery, arcuate artery, cortical radial artery, afferent arteriole, and then we're going to go into something called the glomerulus. This is where our first set of capillaries is. Then there's the efferent arteriole, and then the second set of capillaries is called the peritubular capillaries, and then the cortical radiant vein, arcuate vein, interlobar vein, renal vein, and inferior vena cava. And these ones are the arcuate ones. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correct, but I think that's relatively close. But again, kind of blood coming in, one set of capillaries, traveling over to another place where there's another set of capillaries, and then blood coming out. All right, so that's kind of our main idea here. So visually, if we look at this, here's our renal artery coming in, right? Renal artery coming in, segmental arteries, interlobar arteries, arterial arteries. It's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, all the way until we get out here to the renal cortex, right? And then we've got our cortical radiant arteries, and then eventually it's going to go into those glomerulus and then kind of work its way back out. And you can see it goes smaller, 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 getting larger, 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 interlobar vein, into larger, 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 until we get to this renal vein. And then from that renal vein, it's going to join up into that inferior vena cava and go back up to the heart, to the right atrium of the heart there. But again, kind of branching, 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 little tiny pieces, then collecting, 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 coming back up until it moves back into kind of the major spots there. Okay, so what are we looking at kind of overall? So inside the kidneys, again, we've kind of got this major branching, different type of arteries happening there. And then again, this is what we're looking at inside the renal cortex here is we've got these little tiny, this is our first capillary bed, right, where we have the glomerulus. And then we've got our peritubular capillary bed, which is all of this stuff wrapping around here. And then that's what's going to go back to the veins there. So one capillary bed, second capillary bed. All right. So nephrons, which we're dealing with here, are the structural and functional unit of the kidneys. This is where we're actually doing the filtration and reabsorption of what we need. So each kidney contains over 1 million nephrons, and each nephron consists of two main structures. One part that we call the renal corpuscle, which is this part, and then the renal tubule, which is this part. So corpuscle, corp refers to body, so this is kind of this round little body here, and then tubule because it has some tubes. There's a couple of videos that I've got here, kind of functions of the nephron. This one is just kind of a general overview. It's pretty good. It shows how that kind of fits in with the whole health of the entire body. And the second one, I like this one better, but it does get into some pretty good detail on it. But I recommend them both. Probably if you're just going to watch one, I'd recommend just the second one. Okay, so here again, we're looking at kind of what's happening kind of within this particular nephron unit. So here's one nephron unit, here's another nephron unit. There's kind of different types of nephrons unit, cortical and juxtamedullary nephrons. You don't need to worry about those, but they're just kind of different types of neurons. But again, we've got our renal corpuscle, right, which is a little bulb here, And then we've got the tubular part that's going to goes down that way. All right, so moving on. So the renal corpuscle itself consists of the glomerulus, which is this knot of capillaries, and they're surrounded by these things called podocytes. And they make up the innermost or visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. Podo, like pod, like a podiatrist, refers to foot. So they have these things called a foot process that clings to the glomerulus. But they're kind of leaky, so there's these filtration slits that create a porous membrane so things can leak out of the capillaries, like blood, or probably like small things like sugar, water, salts, and things like that. But big things like red blood cells can't. And then there's this surrounding that, there's the glomerular capsule, or otherwise known as Bowman's capsule. And it's this cup-shaped structure that surrounds the glomerulus. And so here's the Bowman's capsule, or the glomerular capsule. And then here's that, go back here, the glomerulus itself, with these podocytes kind of wrapping around these little foot-like things. And again, the idea is that you've got afferent blood going in, efferent blood kind of going out of that particular part here. So afferent blood going out that way. Okay. And then if we move on here, you can see these podocytes with these foot processes. And again, there's gaps in between, so water, salts, and waste can leave there, but big things can't. So if we kind of back up, so what's happening is this afferent arteriole's got all this blood behind it, pushing it into these teeny tiny little capillaries, teeny little tubes there. And so that extra pressure behind it forces a lot of that fluid out into this space, this glomerular capsule space, and then only some of that stuff gets pushed back on. So we're kind of filtering things out by forcing it out under pressure into that space that's around there. Okay. The renal tubule is the next section. So that extends from the glomerular capsule and ends when it empties into the collecting duct. And then so from the glomerular capsule, there's three things that we look at, something called the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, the distal convoluted tubule. So here's just kind of a visual. So here's our glomerulus, right? So here we've got, this is the peritubular capillaries in red, kind of wrapping around this whole thing. But here we have this proximal convoluted tubule. So convoluted means it just kind of wiggles all over the place, right? Proximal is close. And then it goes down to this loop of Venn, kind of this section down here, right? Collecting the nephron loop. And then it's going to come back up to what they call the distal convoluted tubule. So that's kind of the far end. And this is going to go into the collecting duct. So the process of what we're looking at is due to diffusion, due to concentration gradients of different things, we're going to get things moving into and out of these tubules and into the bloodstream, back into the bloodstream being reabsorbed. So again, we've kind of got these two different things here happening, the two different types of nephrons that we can look at. Okay, so again, afferent, efferent, right, blood comes in, right, and then we're going to have whatever was filtered out, right, everything except for the red blood cells and really big proteins, or most everything, kind of goes through here, right, and then it's going to get pushed down, and then this is surrounded by the capillaries that come up here. So they're going to pick stuff up, and then it's going to go back down through here to that collecting duct. Okay. So these two capillary beds on the glomerulus and the peritubular bed, as we just mentioned. So the glomerulus capillary bed, they're fed and drained by the arterioles, the afferent arteriole and the efferent arteriole. So that gets blood, that passes the blood on, and they're specialized for that filtration with those podocytes. So high pressure forces fluid and solutes out of the blood into that glomerular capsule, into that space there that we just mentioned there before. And then the peritubular capsule, capillary beds, they pick up, they're relatively low pressure, relatively porous, and so they're designed for absorption rather than filtration. So they're picking up things that are coming out of the nephron loop there, and that eventually drains it back into the interlobar vein. So here you can see, again, the one capillary bed and the second capillary bed, the peritubular and the glomerular capillary beds in the respective spots. All right, so that was a lot. So quick mini break. We'll come back and start in just another second, but stand up, stretch around for just a little bit, pause the video. All right, so again, that whole point was to go through and make urine. So we will talk about how to make urine in just a second. Give you a 10-second countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So how do we actually kind of make urine through all there? So we talked about these kind of three processes: glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, but there's also something called tubular secretion. So here is that first part, so the glomerular filtration, so water and solutes are forced out of that through the podocytes. 2, tubular reabsorption, right? So we're starting to pick back things up here. So we can see we pick up water, glucose, amino acids, and whatever needed ions there are, right? And that's going to get moved back into that peritubular capillary. But we're also going to secrete some stuff. So there may be some things that were left in the blood here that we really didn't want. Hydrogen ions, potassium ions, creatine, and drugs. They can be removed through the peritubular blood and secreted into these filtration tubes there. Right. So the glomerulus is a filter, right? So this is the first part that we're looking at. It's non-selective. You can see the things that passed out, forced through it. We kind of mentioned those already. But once stuff is passed out into the space of this tubule, it's known as filtrate, and eventually leaves via the renal tubule. Filtrate will be formed as long as systemic blood pressure is normal. If arterial blood pressure is too low, then filtration stops, because the glomerular pressure will be too low to force stuff out of the capillary bed into there. So that's one of the major things that happens with low blood pressure, is that people can actually develop issues with their kidneys there. Okay. Peritubular reabsorption, so the rest of this here. So we're going to reabsorb things like water, glucose, amino acid, ions. Some reabsorption is passive, but a lot of it is active. So active transport, again, remember, uses ATP. And most of this reabsorption occurs in what we call the proximal convoluted tubule. So that's the first part, so the very beginning. Right? So here's our proximal convoluted tubule, so reabsorbing NaCl, which is salt, drugs, poisons, HCO3, which is, I forget what that one is offhand, bicarbonate, there we are, glucose, amino acids, right? And then we drop into our nephron loop. We're going to lose water here, lose some salt through passive transport, some through active transport, and then we'll pick up kind of a little bit of or get rid of a little bit more salt coming back in to our bloodstream, and then we'll pump into there the potassium and some other drugs there. And this is what's all collected. And again, we can recollect things kind of back out of here as needed as well, out of that collecting duct. So it's really this process of kind of saying, let's get rid of everything, and then let's shuffle back and forth. What do we want to keep? What do we want to keep? What do we want to get rid of? What do we want to get rid of? And then what's left over is urine. So all through here is filtrate. And then once we get down to here, then we're into urine. Okay. So tubular secretion is reabsorption reverse. So materials are moved from the blood. Peritubular capillaries and the renal tubules are eliminated. Hydrogen and potassium ions, creatine. And secretion is important for things that weren't already there in the filtrate, right? Drugs and excess ions and so on. And then whatever is left over in the renal tubules moves towards the ureters, where it gets eventually into the bladder. And we're almost done here. So the major thing we're dealing with, as we mentioned before, was nitrogenous waste. So nitrogenous waste products are poorly reabsorbed, if at all. They tend to remain in the filtrate. So the things that we're trying to get rid of are urea, uric acid, and creatine. And so we can get urea from protein breakdown, uric acid from nucleic acid metabolism, and creatine, which is associated with metabolism in muscles. Okay. And again, we can kind of see, and I kind of mentioned those before there. All right. So in a 24-hour period, we approximately produce 1 to 1.8 liters of urine. The filtrate and urine are very different, as I mentioned. The filtrate, which was that first part, just in those tubules, contains everything that the blood plasma does, except for the proteins. Urine is what remains after the filtrate has lost most of its water, nutrients, and necessary. So we've kind of taken the water back into the kidneys, taken the nutrients back out, and necessary ions back out through reabsorption, and then dumped off the things that we don't want, like the nitrogenous waste and substances that are not needed. All right. So characteristics of urine: pale to clear in color to deep yellow, kind of depending on how hydrated you are. Yellow color is normal. There's a pigment called urochrome that we get from the destruction of hemoglobin. Remember, that's in our blood cell that carries our oxygen. Urine is considered to be sterile at the time of formation when it's in the kidneys there, but depending on what can happen, some people say that when you pee, when you urinate out, it's actually sterile at the time it comes out. Probably not. There's probably some bacteria or some other stuff that can get into the bladder there. Not a lot, but some stuff. It is slightly aromatic, but over time it smells like ammonia, slightly acidic, and there's a specific gravity of 1.001 to 1.035. So that means it is slightly denser than water. So it would sink down below water because it's got more solutes in it, is the thing there. This is just something I found online that shows you kind of some characteristics of color, kind of what the different colors can potentially mean. You can see them on there. Apparently purple doesn't exist, but some of the other ones can, depending on kind of what you're eating. Lots of beets or blueberries, or if you've got genetic diseases or whatnot. So, all right, so what do we find and what do we not find in there? So normally we've got sodium and potassium, urea, uric acid, creatine, ammonia, bicarbonate atoms. Those are normal. Things that are not normally found in urine: glucose, so like blood sugar, blood proteins, red blood cells, hemoglobin, white blood cells, or bile. So all of those usually indicate that there's something going on. So here is just kind of some of those things that we looked at. What is it called if you have that in you? So if you've got a lot of glucose in your urine, it's glucosuria, and it's usually an indication of either excess intake of sugary foods, or perhaps you've got diabetes. You just have so much sugar that it's just getting in your blood that it's just coming out that way. So again, some of these things you can see are kind of non-pathological or pathological, kind of depending on what's happening there. All right, and that gets us to our second stretch break. So that was a good long stretch on that one. The last part is relatively short. So I'll stop here, and we'll pick back up for part 3.